Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
When I was married to my ex-wife like 10, 15 years ago, we would get into arguments. And I remember when I would posit things out, and even when I would try to maybe call her on something and say, hey, that's not cool you did that thing. I remember her throwing back to me well, you did that in this situation over here, or, well, how come you're so perfect? Because you have a mess up over on this side, over in this thing in your life. I used to go, oh, you're right. I guess I can't really call you out on that because you're totally right. I have a deficiency there. So I guess you win this one. That's how I kind of would frame it. And that didn't just happen with her. It happened with a lot of people in my life, but I remember that very clearly in that relationship in specificity. And I had a really hard time going through life when somebody would do something that would be an offense to me, something that I was frustrated by, and I would want to talk with them about it. I remember either self-censoring myself and saying, well, who am I to call that person out on that thing? I mean, I've got stuff that's not perfect in my life either. Or maybe we would be in some kind of a debate or an argument, and they would say, well, look at this. You have this thing over in your life. And I'd say, yeah, you're right. I guess I have to abandon course of calling you out on this. And it's only been in the last maybe 5 years that I've gotten really good at going, wait a second, just because I've got something in my life doesn't mean I'm wrong in this situation, or that I don't have a valid point here, or I don't have a boundary in this. It's something that I've really worked through to say, I can't just sacrifice myself because I'm not perfect, because no one's perfect. I'm never going to be perfect. And it sounds so basic, right? It sounds like such a basic concept, but it's been something that kind of stuck in my psyche after all the personal growth I've done, after a lot of the work I've done. It was something that even 5 years ago, I still had an issue with. And it's something that I've worked through, and I don't do as much now, but it still comes up for me. Sometimes in our business, I'll have a trigger of asking one of our team members to do something, or maybe take the hit on something. I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm not perfect in that area. So I can't really ask them to do this because I wouldn't be able to shine in that light either. Or I can't give them some feedback or some, constructive criticism here, because who am I to call somebody out? I mean, I've got deficiencies in my life too. And while it's still a lot less now, it still comes up for me. It's something that I struggle with. I don't think you had to struggle with this as much, Antonia. I think you're much better at calling people out directly, but this is something that I've had to get through. So we thought we could talk about this on today's episode, because it might be something you listening have struggled with in your life, where you feel like you have to be perfect in order to give people feedback, constructive criticism, or create boundaries in your life. And that's just simply not the case.
Yeah, there's a word for it. It's a logical fallacy. Not necessarily this idea of never being able to call people out because you have imperfections, but specifically never being able to call somebody out about that thing if you've not been perfectly consistent your entire life. Like if your behavior in your life has ever been inconsistent with the thing you're talking about, it's a logical fallacy. It's called tu quoque. And tu quoque means you also, meaning that if you've ever done the opposite of what you're saying, then therefore you are totally unqualified to talk about that thing.
It's Latin, right?
Yeah, it's Latin. Tu quoque means you also in Latin. And the reason why it's a logical fallacy, and I love logical fallacies. I mean, I don't love the fallacies themselves, but I love collecting just reams and reams of logical fallacies. The reason why it is because it doesn't matter if your behavior has been consistent with the thing you're observing. If it's true, it's true. And the reason why it's important to understand that this is a logical fallacy is I think this is a go-to defense strategy for a lot of people. You have to have a perfect record about just about anything before you can acknowledge that thing might not be great in both yourself and another person. Or not in yourself. Obviously, this would be if you're calling out another person and then they say that, well, you haven't always been perfect in this either. It's important to remember that doesn't disqualify you from pointing out the reality that that's not a good thing. And I think in particular, not that we want to go around letting everybody know how bad their behavior is. But there are moments when calling out somebody else's bad behavior is necessary, especially if they are close to you, if their behavior has crossed a boundary, if you need to reflect back to them something that is important to get through in the relationship. You need to be able to acknowledge that something isn't healthy without the person throwing it back as a, sort of a call to hypocrisy. Like, you're not allowed to say this because you're a hypocrite if you do.
Yeah, hypocrisy is the thing. And I think boundary setting is the framework that this really comes up in a lot. I mean, I don't see myself wanting to go around the world correcting everybody all the time anyway. I mean, and if you're that kind of person, then please don't ever hang out with me. But because we probably won't get along very well. But there are times when you feel like your boundaries are being infringed upon. So this is more from like not a defensive place, but in a boundary setting place to say, well, hey, that's not cool that you're doing that. And the person's like, well, who are you to say it? You're not perfect. You're not on the stick about this thing, so you can't say anything about that. And how I look at it, really, I mean, the reason why I think you and I are different, Antonia, is because of how our brains are wired in our personalities. Like, I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, and so I use a decision-making process or function called introverted feeling. We've nicknamed it here at Personality Hacker authenticity. It's all about my core values, my inner alignment, what resonates with me, what's the right action to take. And one of the things that I want to do is one of the things that's interesting to me is congruency of conviction, congruency of belief, congruency of core values. And so if I say to you, Antonia, like, hey, you're breaking in on my boundaries here and you're stepping over a core value, and you're like, well, you don't have that core value because you did that to that person over there. And I'm like, oh, you're right. And so you make me question, not you, the person that said that to me, and this is why it's been a struggle for me, it makes me question my identity and my core value. It's saying, oh, well, who am I? Whereas for someone like you as an ENTP in the Myers-Briggs system, you use the process to make decisions, introverted thinking, or what we've nicknamed accuracy, which is all about what's true, independent of how anybody thinks about this. Like, I don't care how anybody on the planet thinks about this. What is true about what's happening or what has happened? And if it's wrong for you to do that, then it's wrong for you to do that. And regardless of if I've done it in the past, I might have done it every single moment of my life up to this point, but it's still wrong for you in this moment to do it. And it's something that comes much easier for introverted thinking or accuracy to talk about. So I think there's a little bit of a, if this is something you struggle with, much like myself, it probably has to do with your mental wiring and your personality, or some aspect of that in some way, or maybe how you're raised or whatever. But I think that's a key point, is that I think people experience this differently, and this is easier and more challenging for people depending on how they're wired.
The thing that makes it so difficult for me, or kind of sort of maddens me, when people do these appeals to hypocrisy, or most logical fallacies really, is that you never get to improve, right? Like, if you've done this ever and you've not been consistent with this, then you're never allowed to call anybody on it in the future, or never acknowledge that this thing is not a good or a bad thing. You basically have to have a perfect record on everything, which nobody does. So does that mean that nobody ever gets to acknowledge that something is less than optimal behavior? Yeah. Does that mean that you don't get to create boundaries because you don't have a clean record in literally everything you have boundaries around now?
It's like wanting group codependency of the entire planet.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. One of my favorite definitions of codependency comes from my friend Cameron, who said codependency could be distilled down to, I won't call you on your shit if you don't call me on mine. That's like basically codependency. And when we disincentivize each other from being mirrors of our bad behavior by requiring the other person to have a perfect record, then that means that we enter a codependent relationship of, I'm not allowed to call you on your shit and you're not allowed to call me on mine. And like you said, even if I've committed that act every single day my entire life up to this moment, if I say a behavior's bad and I'm accurate that the behavior's bad, it doesn't matter if I'm a bloody hypocrite. It's still a bad behavior, and I can still mirror that back to you and vice versa. Now, if you were to say, you're right, it is a bad behavior, I have not to Quoque, you're not allowed to call me on it, but in fact, I've also seen you do that every moment of every day up until the second, then I should go, oh yeah, you're right, I'm also doing it. Maybe we can help assist each other to not do this bad behavior that we have mutually called out. That would be the healthy version of that.
Yeah, talk about levels of maturity, though, for people to do that for each other.
Right. And we are talking
tough.
We are talking about getting to a place and that's the other thing. Can you get to a place in a relationship where a person can call you on bad behavior and you can hold it, right? You can go, okay, well, let me input for a while to figure out what's going on here and to determine whether or not I think you're seeing something valid, because you might be seeing something I have a blind spot around, or if I don't know if your feedback is accurate at this time, right? Or maybe that was something I dealt with before, but I no longer deal with. It's okay to do that. Like, can you allow somebody to give you some feedback without having to go to a logical fallacy like tu quoque? And what I appreciate about understanding logical fallacies is they remind me that no matter how much I don't like a piece of information, it doesn't matter if that piece of information is true. And I can't shoot the messenger, because the messenger is just a representative of the universe. And the universe is doing me a favor. It's giving me a gift by reflecting back to me a truth that I might not be wanting to see at the moment. And every logical fallacy, for the most part, is a defense mechanism against these pieces of information that the universe is attempting to give us. They're really gifts. They help us move the needle. They help us to become better versions of ourselves. But if we fall back on these logical fallacies, like tu quoque, to go, no, you're not allowed to do that, you're not allowed to say anything because you have not remained consistent with it, then we're throwing the gift that the universe gave us back in its face. And we go, nope, sorry, I don't need this. I actually do better in fantasy. Thank you very much, universe. Like, I prefer my fantasy where I'm the greatest version of any human, and any feedback is unnecessary for me. That's a much better world to live in. And for a moment, it is. For the moment when you want to be right? When you choose rightness over happiness, in that moment you get what you want. And then you do it at the cost of ultimate peace of mind and happiness. So I think it's important to remember that some of these logical fallacies are short-term gain for long-term loss. Being willing to allow people to reflect back to you behavior that is, it's not, the reason why it's reflected back to you is not because it's just hurting other people. It's actually because it's hurting yourself. If it is having a negative effect in the outside world, it means that it's already done its damage inside of you, and that you're just spreading the love at this point, quote unquote, right? You're just spreading the damage around, and that's why it's damaging others. If you can get back to the source within you and actually start working on it and be willing to have these pieces of information reflected back to you and start like actually doing the work internally, then the universe gets to reflect other gifts. Like, the gifts aren't always bad news. Sometimes the gifts are great news. Sometimes the universe gives you feedback that's you're on the right path and you're doing great, and I'm proud of you and thank you so much for stepping up. Sometimes that's the gift that the universe will give you. But if you're unwilling to listen to the opposite feedback, that things need improvement, you will very rarely get the positive feedback from the universe.
So there's really 2 points to this. You're probably the person that is on the receiving end of somebody in your life. Like, if this is resonating with you, you're probably receiving somebody like I've been in my life, in my past relationships, and, in a direct way and an indirect way, basically kind of my wiring in life in general, where I kind of get this message from the world like, well, you can't, who are you to speak up because you're not perfect and you're a hypocrite if you do. And, that's something that you can work through on that side. Or you might be the person who is doing that to others. Like, you're not allowing anyone to call you on anything because you're going, hypocrite, you can't call me until you're perfect. And you've created this insular world around you, this ironclad defensive strategy to where you can't get any kind of calibrated feedback from the outer world to say, hey, I could be a little better version of myself, because your barrier of entry or your requirement for the people giving you the feedback is so high. It's perfection up here, or at least as close to perfection as possible, or at least perfection around the issue they're calling you on, that you can't be told ways that you can improve. And you probably are on one side or the other of this, or maybe not at all. Maybe this isn't something you deal with at all. But if you're resonating with this conversation, you're probably one of those 2 entities. So there's probably different advice for you based on where you're at. If you're the type of person that's created the ironclad defensive strategy, let's take a moment here and look at that. Let's say, how can you think in terms of being receptive to outer world feedback? And instead of seeing maybe the motivation of the person that's telling you this, or maybe an agenda that comes from them of something they want or something they're trying to gain power over you in, Maybe there's a way to look at it to say, well, what if I isolated the thing they're saying out, the truth, the quote unquote truth? Obviously, it's their truth. It's subjective, but there is probably a nugget of truth that you can use from that. Could you isolate out the truth and later ruminate on it, or even like look at that? And it may be steps you have to take. At first, you may not want to let them know, because it's a huge ego hit to let somebody know that you're absorbing their negative feedback or their calibrated feedback to you to do better, right? So you might have to just, at first, secretly go ahead and throw the defense up. You get my permission for this. And then take that feedback and go, what truth could I find in this? If there was truth in this statement or this feedback, where could the truth lie? What could this mean for me in my life to maybe open myself up to this feedback? And eventually, maybe doing that enough, you could get past the resistance in the first place and go ahead and take the ego hit and let them know that they have impacted you in a way where you're going to take the feedback. But let's do baby steps, because if you're the type of person that's created that defensive strategy, by me telling you that right now, even this feedback, you might be saying, well, Joel, you might have the exact reaction to what I'm saying. Like, well, who are you to call me out, Joel? You probably have these deficiencies in this area, this area, this area, this area. If you have that, just take what I'm saying as a little nugget of truth and ask yourself, where could that truth come out and maybe help me see this in a different light? I think that's the point for you if you're coming from the frame of somebody that has a tendency to have that defensive strategy.
I think this idea too of not shooting the messenger is really important. You're right, though. The ego hits are tough, and if you're at a place where you can't receive feedback, whatever protection around your ego you've probably got some pretty solid moats built and spikes up, and like feedback is just, you've already handled receiving feedback because you've created all sorts of barriers and boundaries to feedback. Most people, I would assume, listening to this podcast are people who want to get some feedback, though. They want to become better versions of themselves. They acknowledge that protecting their ego is something that they're going to do, and that's okay. And we're all going to protect our egos at times. And also, we want to get better at that. We don't want to just be in ego protection all the time. We also want to be willing to let portions of our ego die in order to give birth to better versions. And so there's a lot of ego protection happening. But I think for me, one of the most important things I did, and this is probably why I referenced it, is not shooting the messenger. Starting to see feedback as not being from the individual giving it to me, but actually as a piece of information from the universe. And that was really important for me. I think recognizing that the person who's giving me the feedback might not actually be saying the very specific thing I need to hear. But a lot of times when somebody isn't entirely accurate, that's another logical fallacy. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's not a logical fallacy. But when a person isn't entirely accurate, disregarding their entire argument or the entire piece of feedback because there was something about it that was incidentally off, I've started to see almost every single piece of feedback as being relevant in some way, because they might not be saying exactly what I need to work on, but they're reflecting back something that does need to be worked on because I struck them in a way that didn't land. Maybe I need to be better at communication. Maybe I need to be better at image management, which I'm terrible at. And one might think, well, image management, that's not good. But there is something to be said for image management. People don't always take the right message, and a little image management goes a long way. It makes it so that people, what you're doing is you're helping them receive the message you intend. And so maybe I need to get better at that. Maybe I need to understand that other people don't think like me. And so how I show up and the words I'm using, all of that is important. So when they reflect back to me something like, a person could call me arrogant. And I don't actually think I'm an arrogant person. I really don't. I think I've worked really hard on not being arrogant. But they call me arrogant. Well, do I say, well, I'm not arrogant, and so I don't have to take your feedback? Or do I go, well, somehow that's that person's experience of me. So somehow with some people, that is how I'm showing up. How do I show up in a way that's more consistent with how I see myself? And is there a way that I can show up in a less arrogant way that's more in alignment with how I feel about myself? Do I need to show more compassion? Does compassion mean that I use smaller words sometimes, right? Like, I like to use the most accurate word possible. And that means that I've done a lot of work around expanding a vocabulary to get the words just right. And sometimes people just need a little bit of slip up, Sometimes an email that has some what does it mean when you misspellings? Sometimes an email with some misspellings actually lands better than an impeccably written email. Sometimes people need a little earthiness, and they don't want you to be impeccably accurate at all times. And that shows up as arrogant to them. Does that mean that's my problem? Well, it's my problem if I want people to not experience me that way. So even though I don't think that they are reflecting back to me with accuracy something that I'm doing, like they're not saying something that's accurate about me, they are saying they are being accurate in their impression of me. That is accurate. They are telling me something about myself that I now have the opportunity to work on. And so I think for me, not doing a series of defensive logical fallacies, not doing a series of resisting outer world feedback has been all about not shooting the messenger, assuming that the messenger is giving me a piece of information I need, and maybe I need to do some detective work to determine where the gold to be mined is. And I know we've done podcasts on this before. I think we did a podcast a long time ago on feedback that makes you squirm. And I think one of the reasons why this is a topic worth revisiting is not only do we get constant feedback, especially for in personal development, but I also think that since we did that podcast, I think that I have grown immensely in the last few years, in part because of the willingness to take feedback. Mm-hmm. And so now in the past, I saw it as like just being willing to like have people be critical of me. But now I actually see I have watched my ego and portions of my ego die and give birth to something else. I've watched that process happen over and over and over again. I've gotten to a point where I'm so much less defensive than I used to be. And the reason why is because I just kept going. I got to get this feedback. I've got to take it. And I can't do any tu quoques. I can't say, well, what about you? And that's one of the easiest things to do. It's one of the easiest logical fallacies to make, which is like, well, you're not perfect. So who are you? And the answer is a messenger from the universe. That's the answer. Tu quoque? And you also? No, I'm a messenger from, well, not me, but the other person is a messenger from the universe. So what I'm going to tell the universe it's a hypocrite? Of course not. So I think for me, the most important thing has been no longer seeing feedback as simply somebody else's opinion, but seeing as a reflection always of something that needs to be given more attention inside of me.
Yeah. So I resonate with what you're saying, and I completely agree. And I think that works well for somebody that's wired like you.
No, this is good. I know where you're going, and this is really good.
And I'm sitting here thinking, man, had I heard that advice 15 years ago, maybe, and really, like, I almost took that kind of advice too much to heart. Like my path of growth was actually distancing myself from that a little bit more. It wasn't taking all that feedback and assuming that it was always my responsibility and always a message from the universe, and to say, wait a second, like, no, this advice is not calibrated. And I think that, so we probably have, you listening might fall in one of these two camps, right? And like, so that's the second part of this. We talked about the person that's got that ironclad defensiveness. That might be you. You might always try to find the way you're right. Man, this ego thing is so slippery. Like every little aspect of it, there's double binds. There's all these strategies we have. There's these super advanced strategies we have to protect our egos. Like I find myself falling into them all the time, where you kind of like go meta on it, or you couch it in some way to make it seem the best way possible. You have an example of it?
No, I was just about to say, I think I know where you're going, and I want you to be very, I mean, if you would be.
Sure.
I would love to hear you be very specific about why that would have been terrible advice for you, because I agree, actually. I think my advice would have been terrible for you. And I think it's excellent for people like me who have a tendency to be able to deflect feedback and to go, oh, you're an idiot, right? That's very easy for me and my personality type to do. But what were you more likely to do? Because you said you were more likely to go, oh yeah, you're right, I shouldn't say anything.
Well, weirdly enough, I'll just say this, just so there's a little bit of a nuance here. You're more likely when you get public feedback, like let's say under a YouTube video, you're more likely to take that to heart and let that affect you. Whereas I'm almost dismissive of that. But people in my life, they give me feedback. I tend to integrate that more than like the general, like I can just disregard, oh, that's just somebody on YouTube, whatever, blah. I don't even read the comments half the time. Like if it's negative, I'm just like, oh, it's negative. I'll just skip over that or whatever. I don't need to see that. But you're like, oh man, what's this person saying? So there's a little bit of there is some feedback that does affect you more than me, and vice versa. The reason why it was bad feedback, it was mostly my upbringing. Like I was wired, my Judeo-Christian quote unquote upbringing wired me to have a fundamental belief at the core of my being that I was flawed, I was born broken, sinful, wicked, and the default setting was a default setting of death and hellfire. And there was an escape clause, but that was my default setting. I wasn't bad and wrong and sinful because of things I've done in my life. I was bad and wrong and sinful for who I am and for existing on this planet. And man, that is, from my standpoint now in my life, that's a very toxic environment to be born into, right? Like and my parents are wonderful people, and it's couched in this kind of message of love and all this, God's love and everything. But that was the underpinning of the faith background I came from. This underwiring, and like literally terms like I'm like filthy rags, or I'm a worm, I'm destined for destruction, I'm horrible, blah, wretched creature am I. These are the words you use in the religion I was raised in, right?
Yeah, and I'm actually pretty grateful that I didn't get laid on that thick. Yeah. In the religion I grew up in, there was like, I think in all Judeo-Christian religions, there's this concept of like, inherent sin and redemption stories and that sort of thing. But I think it got laid on pretty thick for you, either culturally or in your family, or at least maybe it wasn't laid on that thick. That was just how you took it.
Yeah, I think I always take things to their logical, or what I thought is a logical conclusion, or the lowest common denominator. Like if we distill this down to its core essence, that's basically what I came down to. Unconsciously, and now later years I have conscious words around this. I'm not bad and wrong for the things I've done because I was born in this state based on my ancestors' sin and not obeying God or whatever, right? Which is insane to me. So I had nothing to do with it. I didn't choose to be born, but here I am, and I'm already on a default setting toward death and destruction.
So wrapping it into what we were talking about, then any feedback you got, the assumption was that you're wicked, sinful, so you needed to take it to heart. So even if a person basically kind of set you up to be abused, it set you up so that no matter what abuse a person heaped on top of you, it was your job to take it. Yeah, in almost like an ascetic way, like sort of a self-flagellation way. Yeah, and so effectively, the reason why I wanted to make that distinction is because if that's you, don't listen to me because I have terrible advice for you. Yeah. My advice of like, assume everything is a messenger from the universe and that you need to take all this to heart. Now, granted, when I say they might not be accurate in their reflection back to me, but they are reflecting something back to me that I need to change. And I've got to be a detective to figure out what that is if the content of what they're saying doesn't sit right with me. Like I'm like, maybe not so much that. But they are reflecting back to me something that probably needs some attention. And I've got to figure out what that is and use their clues to determine that. Now, there is something to be said for the people who used, kind of exploited your paradigm and what became the wiring of your mind paradigmatically. The ones that heaped some abuse on you around this and talked about how awful of a person you were, you could say, if you're looking at it in terms of creator versus victim and like the drama triangle versus the empowerment dynamic, that they were reflecting back to you something that needed to change. Absolutely. And it could be that they were reflecting back to you the need to change to get out of the situation, to maybe like if somebody was going to heap abuse on you, the universe might have been like, hey, do you see what you're letting happen here? Yeah, how much of this shit are you going to take before you punch back, kind of thing? Yeah, I mean, metaphorically speaking. Right, exactly. Like, what do you? So, what's your threshold? What's your red line here? Yeah. So, in some ways, that's not entirely inaccurate. And at the same time, I'm definitely coming from a less, like the propaganda around that was a little less intense on my end. So I actually got a little more self-esteem thrown in. I come from a family of people who all think that they're very smart and are very cool and are almost always right. And so for me, dialing that back a notch or two was very healthy for me. And recognizing that when somebody challenged me, it didn't automatically mean that they were wrong and I didn't have to defend myself against them was a pretty big deal for me. But I think for you, because you started out at a different place, then when I say something like assume the universe is giving you a message, maybe take that to indicate that you don't necessarily have to integrate the content of what they're saying, but that the universe still might be trying to give you a message and yet you need to listen to it, but it's one of maybe more self-esteem.
Yeah, or maybe it's a meta message. It's a systemic message. It's a overarching message. It may not be about the thing itself. It might be the circumstances or the setup of your life in general, which I think, so I agree with you. The universe was sending me messages through this experience, but it was a much different message maybe than somebody that, if you're listening right now and you're the defensive type, the messages you might be getting might be more content focused. I mean, they might be structural too. They might be messages of, hey, let some barriers down, let some feedback come in. We just talked about on a podcast about process versus results. Like, let the process happen a little bit here. Like, get into some difference of seeing how this is. And I think for somebody that's wired more like me, where you take things to heart, and I really, truly, at the core of my being, at least this is the story I told myself, I wanted to be a good person, and I really wanted to do the right thing. And so the feedback I would get, I'd go, wow, okay, this is another way I can improve me not being a terrible, worm, disgusting human that was born sinful and wicked. Thank you for the feedback. And then I would weaponize that kind of thing against myself. And that's just not healthy, right? It's a very terrible, insidious abuse dynamic. And if you're that person, we talked, I think, about boundaries before on the podcast. We talked about all that stuff, and those are really good disciplines. But realize that whole projection of, well, you don't have a right to, you're not perfect. Yeah, nobody's perfect. Come on, let's be real here. None of us have a perfect track record in anything, and it's kind of a bad way to go if someone's telling you, you can't call me on this because you're not perfect. You need to realize that doesn't really matter. And you need to be able to, if you're that type of person you don't call people on things, or you don't, not really I hate saying call people on things. I almost imagine somebody like a social justice warrior running around yelling at everybody, telling them how they need to live their lives better, which I don't have much use for. But done in love, telling somebody constructive feedback that you're close to, that you actually have a right to talk to about something, to say, hey, this is a boundary of mine, or you shouldn't be doing that thing. That, to me, I feel like you have the right to do that, even if someone's giving you the feedback to say, oh, you can't call me on that because of whatever ill thing in your life, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. To be fair, there is something to be said for some pride in the position of taking that abuse. There is still pride in there too. It's this different strategy of pride, like the person who won't hear any feedback.
Oh yeah. No, I was very proud. I had huge ego by absorbing all of it. That was my strategy to have my ego protected, really.
Right, because you're willing to listen to anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're the person who will always take it. And so there is I think that there's pride there too. And the messaging from the universe might be, in both cases, the message is intended to break through the pride. There was a House of Cards episode in the first season where the president, or who becomes the president, Frank Underwood, visits his hometown.
Now you ruined it for people if they haven't seen it yet.
Have I? If you haven't watched House of Cards, I don't know. I think it's pretty obvious pretty early on what the trajectory of the show is. But my apologies if that was a big spoiler. Frank Underwood visits his hometown, and he says that for them, their humility is their pride. And so
that was a great episode.
It was such a great episode. And so when you're the kind of person who just takes it, and you're like, oh, that's me being humble. Not really. The more humble a person is, and when they have like healthy humility, but also healthy modesty and healthy pride, and like the picture of health is somebody who has healthy boundaries. And they take the boundary is created not with a wall, but with a gate. But it's also not like it's not a bunch of arrows pointing to, how to get in and just kind of dick with the person internally. It's not like a bunch of, signs going like, just go over and throw rocks at that house. That's no problem. Like, it's a gate, and the gate has an open latch. It's got like an open feature, and you let information in, and you're open and vulnerable. And then when something is dangerous, you stop being vulnerable to it because you respect yourself too much to not let that happen. So I think it's kind of like that whole, like, healthy people all kind of look the same, and they all have healthy boundaries. And if you're in a situation where you happen to be the kind of person who takes everything on yourself, you might do the tu quoque thing back on yourself, meaning that I'm never allowed to call anything. I'm not allowed to have boundaries like we just talked about. I'm not allowed to have them because I'm not pristinely perfect. And that's where the pride comes in, is this idea of pristine perfection is the only thing that will qualify you to play the game of life. And it's the only thing that's going to qualify you to be able to engage in a conversation about appropriate behaviors.
We talked about this in the last podcast about process versus result. And I actually didn't mention this in the last podcast, but as we're talking about this, I'm realizing that this happens. Somebody listening to that, go listen to that, because then you'll know what the heck we're talking about. But basically this idea of refining processes. And some people might be like, well, really refining processes, like you got to be this and this and this and this and check off all the boxes and be perfect before you can be part of our social movement or our cause or stand for this thing or be part of our group or even be able to call out things in the world. Like, you've got to be absolutely perfect across all these things. And I think that's a little bit of what we're talking about here. The same idea in it's like you're requiring like religious level discipline before someone can actually be like to speak up about something, right? You have to be like this rigid, everything's got to be absolutely perfect or you're completely disqualified for this. And we've seen people get kicked out of like things, and like if they're not absolutely perfect, they like lose privileges or they're not part of groups anymore. And it's like, what in the world's happening here? Like, can no one make a mistake anymore in the world? Like, at all, ever?
Yeah, well, that just creates a ton of infighting. Those movements never work because the infighting takes them down. If people are perfectionists about...
Well, it becomes a religion, actually.
It does. It becomes a religion at that point.
Sorry, I'm getting all sidetracked on this, but I think it's a good point to this, what we're talking about here.
Yeah, your energy is different this podcast.
Is it?
Yeah, and I think
I'm standing.
It's because you're standing.
I'm realizing I'm like all like I'm moving. I'm kinesthetic, so I'm like standing and I'm like moving, and I could tell. You're right. My energy is different.
Yeah, you're like, I think you have a more assertive energy because you're standing and you feel like powerful. I'm still sitting. I'm just chill. I can't stand for the podcast because if I do that, I get out of breath. So
yeah.
that makes me sound like I'm not very in shape. I can't
walk you across the room. I have to take a break and breathe.
I gotta sit. No, it's just I think the same thing happens to me as I get all like impassioned and
yeah.
and then I get out of breath. So I'm just sitting and chilling, but I'm like, wow, your energy is just like so assertive right now, and it would be because you're standing. That would make a lot of sense. I wanted to. We probably should wrap this podcast up. I think we've talked about the tu quoque thing a bit, and I think we've talked about this idea of feedback a bit, and allowing yourself to receive messages from the universe, but then not always assume that like how the message is crafted is exactly accurate, and also recognizing that if you're getting feedback, there's something going on that you probably should look at, and then look at the process of what's going on, and then also see your results. Like, I think both things are good. One thing you mentioned social justice warriors, and I happen to know many who listen to our podcast.
I love you all.
And I just wanted to mention that there's some social justice warriors that give the whole a bad name, and
sure,
this might be because we're Gen Xers, but sometimes SJWs kind of go over our heads a little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah.
The militant ones, the ones that we talked about, which have a requirement of some like perfection fidelity. And then I think because I'm usually on board with almost every single thing that social justice warriors want to accomplish, because the results that they want to accomplish, I'm almost always on board with. Very, very few causes I'm not like, yeah, that would probably be a good thing. That'll move the needle.
I think I agree with that.
But it's the results that I agree with, but I don't always agree with the process. Mm-hmm. That's what's going on. And so when we talk about sometimes we'll talk about social justice warriors. I know I've thrown it out a couple times in previous podcasts too. And it's usually because I don't necessarily agree with the process of how it's going about, and especially the fidelity of perfection.
Yeah, and I would say the the reason I brought that up is obviously there are other groups that I get this from, but I don't usually hang out with them. So you're right. There are a lot of social justice warrior type people, and you might be one of them listening right now, and you might hate me forever because I said something negative. I don't know, but it doesn't matter. I still love you. It's cool. So I don't hang out with certain people in certain groups. I tend to hang out with and be around more social justice warrior types. So they're more top of mind because it's been my experience of the people I hang out with. Like they are more likely to do the whole, you can't call me on this because of XYZ. So I'm not saying that they're the only people that do that. It's been my experience that some of the militant styles of that show up are the people, because we often see things eye to eye. Like we have similar viewpoints on the world. We just maybe go about it a little differently. So I end up attracting and being around these kind of people, but often they're the ones in my life now that tend to be the type that point fingers and call and say, you can't do that because of XYZ.
Yeah. I
guess I just want to be clear about that.
Yeah. This is about familiarity and friendship, actually.
Yeah, really, honestly, because I don't hang out with people that think so radically different from social justice warriors because we don't see eye to eye on almost anything except for maybe some family members of mine. That's it.
Yeah. We've got some family members. Well, but here's the deal. If the Christians can forgive us for week by week going like, man, I did not have a good upbringing in Christianity, and we have a lot of Christian listeners, if they can forgive us, I think the social justice warriors can forgive us too.
Sure.
Okay. So, you want to do a wrap up?
Yeah, we can.
Are we good?
No, I hope I offended every single possible group that listens to us at this point.
We didn't really land the plane we just talked about.
What do you think? Okay, you've been listening. Maybe you're social justice warrior. Maybe you're a religious person. Maybe you are somebody who has been on the rigid, lockdown, defensive, not letting anybody in. Or maybe you're a person that's just rolled over, given your power away, and you've allowed people to step on your boundaries. And like myself in my past, where I guess you get to call me on that and I don't get to call you back because, yeah, you're right, I'm deficient in that. Like, where do you fall on that? What's your story? What questions do you have or comments do you have? One of the best places to have your voice be heard is over at personalityhacker.com, directly below this podcast. Leave a comment, ask a question, be a part of this discussion. I don't care what your viewpoint is. As long as you're respectful and you've got an articulate voice, come over and make it heard. Let us know what you think. I think it's really important for your voice to be represented in this community. Speaking of community, you can also find us over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly giving and you want to give some feedback, we'll listen to it. We'll see you as a messenger from the universe. Go to iTunes and leave a rating and review. That helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.